Welcome to the second video of this chapter where I will be showing you how I do line art, and I'll be showing you how I've done line art before with different types of brushes. So from the previous video, I have already decided that I'm not going to use the sketch that I did from the 3D model, and I'll use the one that I freehanded instead. I've got it as a sketch layer on 51% opacity, which I'm going to reduce a little bit, and then creating a new layer on top, a raster layer, I will start doing the line art. I always start with the eyes or the face in general, just because it's the part that I'm probably going to spend more time in terms of level of detail versus the space it takes. The brush that I'm using right now, and I'm using for most things, is called My Crunchy brush, but it's essentially just a version of the Crunchy ink brush that I mentioned earlier. I tweaked it so that it isn't as hard and it looks almost more like a hard pencil brush than an actual pen. I like to keep my line art pretty sketchy, so for instance, when I'm inking the face, I'm not worried about having anything too clean. In fact, I think there's value in keeping some guidelines and some sort of like shape lines in the face. So I'll have that line for the jaw, I'll have the line for the nose, etc., etc. The sketch underneath isn't exactly that cleaned up, so I'm still trying to guess my way around a lot of these things. It's good to sort of toggle visibility of the sketch layer on and off occasionally, as well as flipping the canvas, just so that you can see where your line art is going and whether you need to change anything. In this case, because I sketched the clothes on the sketch layer already, I'm not gonna create a line art for the body and then a line art for the clothes. As in, I'm not going to create a new layer to create the clothes on, since I can see where they'll fit, most of them anyway. Again, just as I was doing it for the sketch, you can see that I hardly ever do any like continuous line when I'm drawing. It's mostly just quick strokes, gives everything this sort of angle feeling, everything's kind of sharp. This repeated stroke technique is also a good thing if your hands happen to be pretty shaky when you're doing line art, because you can simulate that it's a clean line art without actually having to have continuous lines a lot. And this is also part of the reason why I like using pencil-like brushes, because pencil-like brushes will help you sort of disguise that, right? I always struggle with the hands a little bit. Sometimes they come off right in the first try. Sometimes I need to go back into the sketch layer and edit it a little bit to have a better base to work on. I like using very harsh geometrical shapes for fingers. In general, I like having sketches with a lot of hard edges, but in fingers in particular, I think you should avoid using a lot of curved lines. And if you're struggling too much, look at your hand or someone else's hand and try and maybe get a picture of the hand in the same position, so you could just reference from it directly. My line art is generally split into two phases, and I believe that I've mentioned this before here. So the first phase, I'm just going for really loose, really light lines to get the base for the actual line art, and that's the phase when I can just transform, mesh, transform things, edit things, copy and cut, and I'm not worried about having it clean at all. It's almost like a second sketch. Again, some guidelines for the muscles and the shapes underneath. Now I'm adding clothing details that weren't there before by deleting the lines that were underneath. This does add to the sort of messy look of the line art, but it's one way to do it and I quite like it. The alternative would be to have the base sketch or line art and then create a new layer and draw these additional details on top of that. Using the quick stroke technique is also helpful when you've got clothing movement, because clothes in general do not bend in like continuous soft ways. They will have angles even if they're not very obvious. So if you're working on them, if a piece of cloth is floating and you want to give that floating effect, having the quick strokes rather than one continuous line for it might help you. Same thing for the hair, to be honest. Hair can be very curly, but I like giving it a bit of a hard edge for most hairstyles. So again, quick stroke method. And then here it's a mix of me drawing the outline and me drawing some details inside the hair to start with. I struggled a little bit because I didn't have the actual head shape underneath, so I've got a lot of messy lines that didn't really help me see where the head was so that I could put the hair in there properly. This is of course a shortcut. To do it properly, I should have had the head sketch as well. Sometimes having the sketch underneath can hinder your perception of the shapes you're drawing, so I do like to hide the sketch layer for certain parts. The hair is one of the few things that I always draw on a separate layer so that I can erase the parts that it's standing over in the base line art layer. As my style currently stands, I erase everything that the hair is over except for eye details. For eye details, I just sort of stroke with a small eraser over them, just so you can see that there's something over them, but they're still visible. Unless I intentionally want to hide the eyes. Now the second stage of line art is going over most of the lines that I created in the first stage and adding some line variation and some minor sort of shading effect. There aren't a lot of tricks to doing this. It's basically you add a thicker line over places where there's intersection of shapes, you know, places where there's maybe a sharp curve or something. And it is a matter of practice and a matter of looking at how other people do it to get a better sense of how this sort of style works. Not all line art has this. You generally see it in people that spend a lot of time in line art and really enjoy it, as is the case with me. And here I'm adding details to the hair. I generally try to make the actual outline of the character be more marked than the details inside, and the same thing happens for separate parts. So the hair will have a darker outline than the details inside the hair. The face will have a darker outline than the details inside the face, like the eyes and the nose. And in general, the character itself will have a darker outline than the details inside the character. I add some minor shading, so like some black parts in this style. I haven't done it always, and I don't do it with every brush that I use, but some styles work better, some work worse with this. I'm also not fully comfortable adding a lot of black areas to my drawings. Again, working on hair is a lot about balancing out details and non-details. So you can't just have lines everywhere. It gets really messy really quickly, and I still struggle with that sometimes. In terms of brush size, both parts of the line art process are done with the same brush size for me, or at least very similar ones. Sometimes I alter between the 10 pixel and 15 pixel for this particular brush, for instance. But in general, I like to have a brush that allows me to have very thin lines, but also if I put a bit more pen pressure into it, it allows me to have some variation. Add some more details on muscles, some more details on clothes. Another advantage of the very sketchy style is that you don't necessarily need to have a full grasp on the materials or the clothes or even the muscles, you know. You can add some sketchy lines to it and give a sense of texture or a sense of shape very easily, which is something that is harder to do if your line art style is cleaner. This pure black shadows part, I don't personally think it's that relevant even in this style. I like to do it because I think when you have the line art isolated from the colors, they look really nice. However, when you add colors and when you add actual shadows, this kind of becomes a bit irrelevant. Sometimes it might hinder as well, so if you're adding black shadows and you're not entirely sure where the lighting is coming from yet, which is sort of the case here, you might end up having a really black shadow in an area that's supposed to be, you know, lit with whatever light source you've got. It's happened to me before, and that's why I sort of avoid using too much black. But a part of me just really likes to see it in the line art, so I keep doing it. Another thing that I want to show you, and I'm doing it right now, is that you can sometimes, if you've got very details like very thin ropes or lines or belts, whatever, you can use that line property effect that I told you about earlier in this course, where you can give the layer an edge color. And if you give the layer a black edge color and you reduce its size to like 1 or 2 pixels, you'll see that you can draw in white and the outline of your drawing will be a line. So that's very useful for certain aspects of line art. And then you can merge that in with your line art layer, and that's still gonna have that white background color, so you can go edit and you can go convert brightness to opacity, which will essentially make your black lines become black lines and the white parts disappear because the opacity on white parts is 0. What I'm doing right now is demonstrating how you can use the decoration subtools on your line art. For instance, here I've got a bunch of subtools that have to do with clothing textures and ropes, etc. All of these also add a white base to the lines. So again, I'm gonna have to do the convert brightness to opacity thing. I've decided to actually use these zipper ones. This isn't something that I use a lot, especially not in the comic, but you know, you've got things like chains, ropes, pretty much anything you can think of, you'll probably find a decoration brush for it in the asset store. So you don't have to hand draw everything, you know. Then I merge it, I go edit, convert brightness to opacity. Convert brightness to opacity is also extremely useful if you accidentally start drawing on the paper layer, for instance, or even on your sketch layer. If you draw on your sketch layer, with Clip Studio Paint this shouldn't happen as often, because if you turn a layer into a sketch layer through the sketch layer option, it'll be blue or whatever color you decide, so you will notice that you're creating the line art in the sketch layer because it's going to be blue even if you're using a black ink. However, if you're using a sketch that isn't a default Clip Studio Paint sketch layer and you accidentally draw over it, provided that the opacity of the sketch is lower than the opacity of your lines, you can always just increase the contrast and then go edit, convert brightness to opacity. It might not fully solve your problem, but it'll get rid of most of your sketch layer issues. Another interesting thing you can do with line property is the other border effect, so the one on the right side, which will essentially make the lines have a sort of darker aura to them, so it's a blurred effect. And you can change the range, you can change the opacity, darkness, and the blurring width. This is something that I've used with line art, both in and out of the comic, with certain brushes. It isn't something that I'm using right now because I've sort of tried to, move away from having too many effects on my lines, but it is something that looks extremely nice in certain styles and certain circumstances. So what I'm gonna do now is I will go over the face, hair, and scarf parts of this drawing with different line art brushes so that you can see what effects, different settings can have. Right now I am using the Smooth India ink brush, which I believe is a default from Clip Studio Paint and I mentioned in the brush video. This one has some stabilization, so you can see that I don't do the sort of sketchy line thing with this one. It's more about smooth lines. It is a thicker brush as well, so I'll be, putting more emphasis in line weight in a single stroke. It does still have a pencil feel to it. I still really like this brush. I used it for a long time. With this type of brush, I would probably not do the line art in 2 stages. However, I am drawing over line art that's already clean, so if this was a sketch underneath, I might still do that. It's obviously easier when you're drawing over lines that already exist. I'll speed this one up a little bit just so that we can get to the final result and compare it to the one that I had with the other brush. Again, my tendency is always to try and do the more geometrical lines, even in the hair and even with a stabilized soft brush. There is one thing that I do differently when I'm using this type of brush, or any type of brush. It doesn't really depend on the brush I'm using, it depends more on like what I feel like doing, but essentially I have the hair layer over the body layer or the face layer, and instead of just deleting a little bit of the eyes and eyebrows, I'm gonna go over them with a lasso tool, cut and paste so it creates a new layer, and then I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer and merge it down again. So now, you know, the hair is over the face. It's not fully hiding the eyes, but you know, they're a bit hidden. The main reason I've moved away from this type of brush was because I was putting a lot of weight into line art. You know, as you can see at the end of working with a brush like this, I get line art that's heavier than with a thinner brush, and it's not the effect that I want or the effect that I prefer. You know, it is a matter of taste in the end. So that's the original line art or the first line art. You can see it's a lot rougher, it's got a lot more texture, and then you've got the cleaner line art on the side. Still has some texture, still looks very kind of pencil-like, but it's cleaner and more, I guess I would say a bit more stylized as well. So now we're gonna try a second brush, or a third brush should I say. The brush that I'm going to go for right now, and I will also speed it up after a bit, it's going to be the Crunchy Ink brush, you know, the one that I bring up every now and then, and on which I base the brush that I currently use. This one is just to demonstrate what a hard ink brush would look like if I was using it. I never use anything that doesn't have pen pressure. However, sometimes I've tried to use hard ink brushes, and this was the one that gave me the best results. Even for this one, I would split the line art into stages normally if I wasn't drawing over line art that's already clean. Mostly because this brush also relies a lot on line width variation and really dark shadows in the line art, you know, the black spaces. So those are things that I'd probably add after I had one first, you know, line art round. This is a very fast brush in any circumstance that I've used it. Again, the hair is very angular. This brush has no stability, so it does help me have a lot of freedom with the strokes that I make. I'll use that technique of hiding the eyes only a little bit, you know, just deleting a little bit of them when they're covered by hair. And voila, that is the second type of line art that I could do. Just adding some more shadows towards the end. This style is a lot more friendly towards having really black shadows, which is another reason why I struggle using it sometimes, because I do struggle knowing where to add the black and where to not add the black. Especially if I don't know where the light source is. So now you can see the three styles in comparison, and I'm still going to do an additional one. So the next brush and the last brush that I'll show you in terms of line art is going to be a sort of very clean brush, a very soft one. I haven't used a brush like this in a long time, so the one that I'm going to go for is the Paint Line Pen brush, which I believe I downloaded from the asset store. but I don't remember which one I used the most when I was trying to go for very clean line art. The main advantage of this style is that it looks really good. I really like the effect, I like how clean things look, and it's very satisfying to use as well. I do really like creating very clean line art. However, the cleaner the line art is, I found, the more I find myself spending time correcting it. This brush doesn't allow for a lot of back and forth, it doesn't allow for a lot of artifacts in your line art, which the current style that I use is full of. And when it comes to hard surfaces, brushes like this will pretty much force you to get them right, while a sketch brush might be a lot more lenient towards, you know, not having a completely straight line somewhere or a completely circular line somewhere, etc., etc. I'm not entirely sure if this is easy to understand for somebody who hasn't tried these different types of brushes or line art styles, but I guess just take my word for it, this brush makes my line art take a lot longer. And personally, I'm the type of person that will use the same brush for both my comic work and my any other work, really. So whatever brush I'm using for the comic is the brush that I'll be using for anything, which means that I can't just go, yes, I'll use the clean line art for some illustrations and then the sketchy one for the comic. It is a personal thing. If you're working on a comic and you have illustration on the side, I think a lot of people have different styles for one and the other, and it seems like a good thing. It's just not the way that I do things. I'm speeding it up, but it is already pretty obvious that it's taking not too much longer than the other brushes, because again, I'm not working directly on a sketch, I'm working on a line art that's already there and clean. But it is taking longer, and I do feel myself sort of compelled to add not necessarily more detail, but more accurate detail to things, which makes line art both take longer and be slightly more tiring. I do add some black spaces in here. I think I generally didn't, but since I've grown used to the other brush that I'm currently using, that's just kind of bled into all my styles. And there you go. So you see like 3 different styles of line art. One of them is sort of thick, soft ink brush. The other one is just soft ink brush, and then you've got a hard ink brush. They have different vibes to them, I would say. The one that I'm using right now is sort of a balance between sketchy and inky, you know, and I'm very fond of it. And I do tend to come back to this sort of style even when I try different things out. Just to close off, a little note on pen pressure, because this is relevant for my line art, and as somebody who spends hours and hours doing just line art, it's the main thing that I do for my comic. It is extremely important that my pen pressure settings aren't, you know, killing my hand. So although you can adjust pen pressure settings in your system settings, usually, at least in my case I can, so you know, I'm using a Mac and I can go to the settings of the tablet itself and adjust the pressure, you know, pressure sensitivity. I believe that mine is a bit more on the soft side. However, if you don't have that option, or if you want to complement that option, which I usually do, you can go within Clip Studio Paint, you can go to Clip Studio Paint menu and open pen pressure settings, and then draw some lines on the screen with the usual pressure that you want to apply. You know, if your hand is very sore, for instance, you can open this menu and just do the strokes that you can do comfortably. And Clip Studio will read those strokes and go, okay, so this is the range of pressure that this person uses while drawing, and adjust things to it. This might affect the way that certain brushes look, it might affect the way they feel, but ultimately I suggest that you look into it and you try it out, because it's a good thing to get used to in case you need to adjust your settings because your hand is tired, because the pen pressure isn't enough, because it's too much, etc, etc. Sometimes the brush doesn't feel right on one determined pressure setting, but it might feel right on another. And that is all that I've got for line art today. I hope that you took something from it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I definitely encourage you to try out, at least a couple of line art brushes on the same drawing, just to see how you feel about it. A lot of the line art process for me is about trying things out, and when I'm bored or when something isn't working for me, I just download a new brush or I change a new brush and I try it out. And a lot of the time, this type of change, it can make my style a little bit inconsistent at times in terms of line art, but it makes things fun for me. So there's that. In the next